The Centre. A low grey building of only 34 floors. Over the main entrance, the words Central London Hatching and Conditioning Centre, and below that, the motto of the World State: Community, Identity, Stability. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north. Cold in spite of the summer outside, in spite of the high temperature of the room itself, a thin, unfriendly light came in through the windows, falling on the glass and bright metal and coldly shining white surfaces of a laboratory. The feeling of winter was strong there. The clothes which the workers wore were white, and their hands were covered with pale rubber, the colour of a dead man's face. The light was frozen and dead. Only from the shining equipment on the long work tables did it borrow a certain rich life, lying along the polished surfaces like butter. "And this," said the director, opening the door, "is the fertilizing room." Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were working away as the director of hatching and conditioning entered the room, deep in the silence of people completely occupied by their task. A group of newly arrived students, very young, pink and inexperienced, followed nervously, rather unhappily, at the director's heels. Each of them carried a notebook in which, whenever the great man spoke, he wrote desperately. The occasion was an unusual one. Opportunities of hearing from the DHC for Central London about the work of the centre were rare, but he always insisted on personally conducting his new students round the various departments. "Just to give you a general idea," he would explain to them. For, of course, some general idea they must have if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one as possible if they were to be good and happy members of society. For details, as everyone knows, lead to virtue and happiness. Generalities, though necessary for some purposes, are dangerous. A peaceful and efficient society is based on practical workers, not on thinkers. "Tomorrow," he would add, with a mixture of friendliness and firmness in his manner, "you will be settling down to serious work. You won't have time for generalities. Meanwhile, it was a privilege. Straight from the director's mouth into the notebook. The boys wrote their notes as fast as they could. Tall and rather thin, but upright, the director advanced into the room. He had a long chin and big teeth which were only just covered by his full, curved lips when he was not speaking. Old, young, 30, 50? It was hard to say, and anyhow, in this year of stability 632 AF, nobody thought of asking such a question. "I shall begin at the beginning," said the DHC, and the more eager students wrote in their notebooks, "Begin at the beginning." "This is where the process starts." And, opening a door specially constructed to prevent heat from escaping, he showed them shelf after shelf of numbered test tubes. "The week's supply of eggs. These are kept at blood heat while the male fertilizing agents," and here he opened another door, "have to be kept at 35 degrees instead of 37. Blood heat would destroy their fertilizing power." While the pencils raced over the pages of the notebooks, he gave them a brief description of the modern fertilizing process. spoke first, of course, of the operation necessary for its beginning. The operation accepted willingly for the good of society, not to mention that those on whom it is performed are paid 6 months' extra salary, described how the eggs, after removal from the body, were kept alive and developing, mentioned the liquid in which they were kept, and leading the students to the work tables, showed how this liquid was taken from the test tubes, how, drop by drop, it was carefully examined on specially warmed slides, how the eggs were examined to make sure they were normal, and then counted, how they were afterwards transferred to a container which, and he now took them to watch the operation, was placed in a warm solution in which the male fertilizing agents swam freely, at least 100,000 of them in every thousandth of a litre of solution. How, after 10 minutes, the container was lifted out of the solution. How the fertilized eggs went back on the shelves. There the alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, but the gammas, deltas and epsilons were brought out again after only 36 hours to be treated by Bokanovsky's process. Bokanovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebooks. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult. That is normal. But a Bokanovskified egg will divide into many others, from 8 to 96, and every one will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, producing 96 human beings instead of 1. Progress. But one of the students was foolish enough to ask what advantage this method of producing human beings had over the natural way. My good boy! The director turned sharply and stared at him. Can't you see? Can't you see? Bokanovsky's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. Social stability. Standard men and women, all exactly the same. The staff for the whole of a small factory from one single Bokanovskified egg. If we could Bokanovskify without limit, then for the first time in history, we should truly reach our aim of community, identity, stability. But unfortunately, the director shook his head. There is a limit to how much we can Bokanovskify. 96 seemed to be the limit. 72 a good average. Noticing a fair-haired and red-faced young man who happened to be passing, the director called to him. Mr. Foster, come along with us and give these boys the benefit of your knowledge by explaining the processes the embryos go through. Mr. Foster smiled. With pleasure. They went. The bottling room was a scene of ordered activity. Pieces cut from the pigs' stomachs came up from the organ store below in little lifts. The lift doors flew open. The assistant had only to reach out a hand, take a piece, place it in the bottle and smooth it down. And before the bottle had travelled out of reach along the endless belt, another piece had come up from below ready to be fitted into yet another bottle, the next in that slow, never-ending procession on the belt. The bottles advanced, and the next group of assistants made a small cut in each piece of stomach as it moved past them in its container. Dropped into the cut an egg taken from one of the test tubes, smoothed the edges of the cut over it, poured in the salt solution in which it was to grow, and already the bottle had passed into the next room. Here, the date of bottling and all necessary details about its contents were marked on it. They passed through a room where details of all the bottles were stored on cards. These details were used by the officials who had to calculate the numbers in each group needed for society at any time. From here, they sent their figures to the fertilizing room, which must provide the embryos that they asked for. Opening a door, Mr. Foster now led the way down a stairway into a room below ground level, still very hot and with all daylight carefully shut out. The only light was artificial light, red and faint. "Embryos are like photograph film," said Mr. Foster, smiling at his own joke. "They can only stand red light." This was where the sex and social grade of each future human being was determined. He pointed out 3 long rows of shelves, one above the other. Along them, the bottles moved very slowly during the treatment given to them, before they came out into the daylight, and the contents changed from the condition of embryos into that of living people. 267 days was the time required for the whole process to be completed. On the 267th morning, daylight and independent existence, so called. "But in that time, we've managed to do a lot to them," said Mr. Foster with an air of satisfaction. "Oh, a very great deal." As they walked round, he described the various methods of treatment according to the sex an embryo was to possess and the place which it was to fill in the community. He told the students how the babies emerged from these processes already graded as alphas or epsilons, as future factory workers or future world controllers, he was going to say, but corrected himself and said, future directors of production, instead. The director smiled. Mr. Foster now became very technical in his explanations. He described how the embryos were developed in a rich solution which took the place of blood. He showed how the supply of oxygen to each grade of embryo was controlled in order to produce the correct degree of development of brain or body at each stage in its growth. He paused by a shelf of embryos who were to work in hot countries or in factories such as steelworks. They passed through a chamber in which the embryos were exposed first to heat and then to an extremely unpleasant degree of cold, time after time, so that when they were ready to leave the bottles and become babies, they would love heat and fear cold. Later on, their minds would be trained to think what their bodies already felt. "Down here, we condition them to need heat for their physical development," ended Mr. Foster. "The nurses upstairs will teach them to enjoy it." "And that," added the director, "that is the secret of happiness and virtue. Liking what you've got to do. All our conditioning aims at that, making people like their unavoidable place in society." In a space between 2 chambers, a nurse was carrying out a very delicate operation with a needle on the contents of a passing bottle. The students and their guides stood watching her for a few moments in silence. "Well, Lenina," said Mr. Foster, when at last she took the needle from the bottle and straightened herself up. The girl turned towards them. In spite of the faint red light, One could see that she was very pretty. "Henry!" She smiled at him, showing a row of shining white teeth. "What are you giving them?" asked Mr. Foster, making the tone of his voice very professional. "Oh, the usual tropical fever and sleeping sickness." "Tropical workers start being treated at this point to resist tropical diseases," Mr. Foster explained to the students. Then, turning back to Lenina, 10 to 5 on the roof this afternoon, he said to her, as usual. "Wonderful," the director smiled at Lenina, touching her bottom lightly with one hand. He led the students to a shelf where rows of the next generation's chemical workers were being trained to survive exposure to great quantities of lead and other dangerous substances. On another shelf, the first of a group of 250 future rocket engineers had just reached a point on the moving belt at which a special machine began to spin their bottles at a regular speed. "To improve their sense of balance," Mr. Foster explained. "Doing repairs on the outside of a rocket in flight is not an easy job. We reduce the supply of artificial blood when they're the right way up, so that they're hungry, and double it when they're upside down. They learn to like being turned over and over like this. In fact, they're only truly happy when they're standing on their heads." "And now," Mr. Foster went on, "I'd like to show you some very interesting conditioning for Alpha Plus intellectuals. We have a big group of them on shelf 5, middle level." But the director had looked at his watch. 10 to 3, he said. "No time for the intellectual embryos, I'm afraid. We must go up to the nurseries before the children have finished their afternoon sleep." Chapter 2. State Conditioning. Mr. Foster left them at the door of the unbottling room, where the embryos were taken from their bottles to go through the all-important process of passing into the condition of babies, the first real stage on their way through life as human beings. The DHC and his students took the nearest lift and were carried up to the 5th floor. "Infant nurseries, conditioning rooms," said the sign. The director opened a door. They were in a large empty room, very bright and sunny. The whole of the southern wall was a single window. Half a dozen nurses, wearing the official uniform of white coat and trousers, with their hair hidden under white caps, were putting out big bowls of roses in a long row across the floor. The nurses stood still as a mark of respect when the DHC came in. "Put out the books," he said. In silence, the nurses did as he had ordered. The books were put out between the rose bowls, a row of attractive children's books, each open at some brightly coloured picture of an animal or a fish or a bird. "Now bring in the children." The nurses hurried out of the room and returned in a minute or two, each pushing a set of 4 shelves on wheels. Each shelf, protected with wire nets, was loaded with 8-month-old babies, all exactly alike, a Bokanovsky group, it was evident, and all, since they were deltas, dressed in light brown clothes. "Put them down on the floor." The infants were unloaded. "Now, turn them round so that they can see the flowers and books." The babies were turned round. At once they began to move towards the books, attracted by the bright colours and pretty shapes. As they moved, the sun came out from behind a passing cloud. It shone on the roses and on the pictures, lighting them up and making them even more beautiful. The babies cried out loud with pleasure and excitement. The director rubbed his hands with satisfaction. "Excellent," he said. "It might have been done on purpose." Some of the babies were already at their goal. Their little hands reached out uncertainly, touching the roses and the brightly coloured pages. The director waited till they were all happily busy. "Watch carefully," he said, and lifting his hand, he gave the signal. The head nurse, who was standing at the other end of the room, pressed a switch. There was a violent explosion. Alarm bells sounded. The children screamed. Their faces were ugly and twisted with fear. "And now," the director shouted, making himself heard above the noise, "now we will make the lesson clearer with a small electric shock." He waved his hand again, and the head nurse pressed a second switch. The screams of the babies became desperate. Their little bodies stiffened. Their little arms and legs made sudden movements as if they were being pulled by hidden wires. "We can send electric shocks all the way through that part of the floor," shouted the director in explanation. "But that's enough," he signalled to the nurse. The explosions ceased. The bells were silent. The little arms and legs stopped moving, and the screams grew less desperate. "Offer them the flowers and books again." The nurses obeyed, but at the mere sight of the roses and of those pretty pictures of pet animals, the infants drew back in horror and began to cry louder than ever. "Notice that?" said the director with an air of great satisfaction. "Notice that?" Books and loud noises, flowers and electric shocks. Already in the minds of the babies, these pairs of things were connected, and repeated lessons would make the connection permanent. "They'll grow up with what at one time would have been called a natural hatred of books and flowers. They'll be safe from books and flowers all their lives." The director turned to his nurses. "Take them away again." Still screaming, the babies in brown were loaded onto their shelves again and wheeled out, leaving behind them the smell of sour milk and a very welcome silence. One of the students held up his hand to ask a question. He could see quite clearly why you couldn't have low-grade people wasting the community's time over books, and that there was always the risk of their reading something that might upset their conditioning in some way, but he couldn't understand about the flowers. Why go to the trouble of making it impossible for deltas to like flowers? Patiently, the DHC explained. If the children were made to scream at the sight of a rose, there were good economic reasons for this. Not so very long ago, about a century, gammas, deltas, even epsilons had been conditioned to like flowers in particular, and wild nature in general. The idea was to make them want to be out in the country at every opportunity, and so force them to use transport. "And didn't they use transport?" asked the student. "Quite a lot," the DHC replied, "but nothing else." Flowers and scenery, he pointed out, have one great fault. They are free. A love of nature keeps no factories busy. It was decided to take away the love of nature, at any rate among the lower classes, to take away the love of nature but not the need for transport. For, of course, it was necessary that they should keep on going to the country, even though they hated it. The problem was to make them use transport for a reason which was economically better than a mere affection for flowers and scenery. It was solved. We condition the lower classes to hate the country, ended the director. But, at the same time, we condition them to love all country sports. Then we make sure that country sports require expensive equipment. So they buy and use manufactured articles as well as transport. That is the reason for those electric shocks. I see, said the student, full of admiration. Once upon a time, the director began speaking again. Once upon a time, while our Ford was still on Earth, there was a little boy called Reuben Rabinovich. He was the child of Polish-speaking parents. You know what Polish is, I suppose? A dead language, like French and German. And parent? There was an awkward silence. Several of the boys turned red in the face. They had not yet learned the difficult art of distinguishing between immorality and pure science. One, at last, had the courage to raise a hand. Human beings used... He paused. The blood rushed to his cheeks. Well, they used to give birth to their own babies. Quite right. The director nodded. And when the babies were unbottled... Born, came the correction. Well, then they were the parents. I mean, not the babies, of course, the other ones. The boy fell silent, covered with confusion. In short, the director said, the parents were the father and mother. This was really strong language, even if it was science and not just dirty talk. The words fell with a crash into the awkward silence. Mother, he repeated loudly, rubbing in the science. He leant back in his chair. These, he said, are unpleasant facts. I know it. But then most historical facts are unpleasant. He returned to little Reuben. One night, his father and mother, crash, crash, forgot to turn off the radio in his room. For you must remember that in those days, children were brought up by their parents and not in state conditioning centres. While he was asleep, a radio programme was broadcast from London. Next morning, little Reuben woke up and repeated word for word a long lecture by that strange old writer, George Bernard Shaw. His crash and crash could not understand a word of it, of course. They thought their child had suddenly gone mad and sent for a doctor. He, fortunately, understood English, recognized the speech which he had also listened to on the previous evening, realized the importance of what had happened, and sent a letter to a medical journal about it. The principle of sleep teaching had been discovered, said the director. Now, come with me. The students followed him to another lift, from which they stepped out at the 14th floor. Silence, silence, whispered a loudspeaker. Silence. "Silence! Silence!" repeated other loudspeakers at intervals along the corridor. The students and even the director himself, without thinking, obeyed the voices and walked on the tips of their toes. They were alphas, of course, but even alphas have been well conditioned. Silence! Silence! The air of the 14th floor was heavy with the whispered command. The director carefully opened a door. They entered a room where the light was very low. 80 little beds stood in a row against the wall. All that could be heard was light, regular breathing and a continuous hum like the sound of very faint voices speaking softly at a great distance. A nurse stood up as they entered. "What's the lesson this afternoon?" the director asked quietly. "We had elementary sex for the first 40 minutes, she said. But now it's gone over to elementary class consciousness. The director walked slowly down the long line of beds. In each one lay a child asleep. 80 little boys and girls with pink, healthy faces lay there softly breathing. There was a whisper under every bed cover. "Elementary class consciousness, did you say? Let's have it repeated a little louder by the loudspeaker." At the end of the room, a loudspeaker hung on the wall. The director walked up to it and pressed a switch. "All wear green," said a soft but very distinct voice, beginning in the middle of a sentence. "And Delta children all wear light brown." Oh no, I don't want to play with Delta children. And Epsilons are even worse. They're too stupid to be able to read or write. Besides, they wear black, which is such an ugly colour. I'm so glad I'm a beta." There was a pause, then the voice began again. "Alpha children wear grey. They work much harder than we do because they're so clever. I'm really very glad I'm a beta because I don't work so hard. And then we are much better than the gammas and deltas. Gammas are stupid. They all wear green, and delta children all wear light brown. Oh no, I don't want to play with delta children. And epsilons are even worse." The director pushed back the switch. The voice sank to the faintest of whispers, which could just be heard from beneath the 80 bed covers. "They'll have that repeated 120 times, 3 times a week, for 30 months while they are sleeping. Then they go on to a more advanced lesson. Sleep teaching is the most powerful force of all time in social education. The child's mind becomes these suggestions, and the total of these suggestions is the child's mind. And not only the child's mind, the adult's mind too, all his life long. The mind that thinks and desires and decides. But all these suggestions are our suggestions." The director almost shouted in his enthusiasm. "Suggestions from the state!" A noise made him turn round. "Oh, Ford," he said in another tone, "I've woken the children." Chapter 3. Off-Duty. In the 4,000 rooms of the centre, the 4,000 electric clocks struck 4. From the loudspeakers came the order. "Main day shift off duty. Second day shift on duty. Main day shift off. From her dark underground room, Lenina Crown shot up 17 floors, turned to the right as she stepped out of the lift, walked down a long passage and, opening the door marked Girls' Dressing Room, went to a cupboard with her name on it in which her outdoor clothes were hanging. There she took off her working uniform and went along to the bathroom. Streams of hot water were running into or out of 100 baths. The other girls who had come off duty were talking at the tops of their voices. A loudspeaker was playing a loud and cheerful military march. After her bath, Lenina went back to her cupboard to change into her outdoor clothes. "Hello, Fanny," she said to the young woman who had the cupboard next to hers. Fanny worked in the bottling room, and her second name was also Crown. But as the 2,000 million people of the world had only 10,000 names between them, this was not surprising. "Who are you going out with tonight?" asked Fanny. "Henry Foster." "Again?" Disapproval showed on Fanny's face. "Do you mean to tell me you're still going out with Henry Foster?" "Well, after all," Lenina protested, "it's only about 4 months since I've been having Henry." "Only 4 months? What a thing to say! And what's more," Fanny went on, pointing an accusing finger, "there's been nobody else in all that time, has there?" Lenina turned red, but she said loudly, "I don't see why there should have been." "Oh, she doesn't see why there should have been," Fanny repeated, as though to an unseen listener behind Lenina's left shoulder. Then, with a sudden change of tone, "But seriously," she said, "I do think you ought to be careful. It's such bad behaviour to go on and on like this with one man. At 40 or 35, it wouldn't be so bad. But at your age, Lenina, no, it really won't do. And you know how angry any affair makes the DHC if it goes on too long. 4 months of Henry Foster without having another man? Well, he'd be very angry if he knew." "Of course, there's no need to give him up," Fanny went on in a kinder voice. "Have somebody else from time to time, that's all. He has other girls, doesn't he?" Lenina admitted it. "Of course he does. Trust Henry Foster to be the perfect gentleman, always correct. And then there's the director to think of. You know how he insists on correct behaviour." Lenina nodded. "He touched me on the bottom this afternoon." "There, you see," said Fanny. "That is an example of correct manners, a model of strictly conventional behaviour." "And to tell the truth," said Lenina, "I'm beginning to get just a bit tired of nothing but Henry every day." She pulled on her underwear. "Do you know Bernard Marx?" she asked, trying not to show too much interest by her tone of voice. Fanny looked surprised and a little alarmed. "Bernard Marx of the psychology department? You don't mean to say—" "Why not? Bernard's an Alpha Plus. Besides, he asked me to go to one of the savage reservations with him. I've always wanted to see a savage reservation." "But his reputation! What do I care about his reputation? They say he doesn't like any of the state sports." They say, laughed Lenina.
And then he spends most of his time by himself, alone.
There was horror in Fanny's voice.
Well, he won't be alone when he's with me. And anyhow, why do people behave so badly to him? I think he's rather sweet.
She smiled to herself. How shy he had been. Frightened almost, as though she had been a world controller and he a gamma-minus machine minder.
But he's so ugly,
said Fanny.
But I rather like his looks. And then he's so small.
Smallness was so horribly and so definitely low grade.
I think that's rather sweet, said Lenina. One feels one would like to have him as a pet. You know, like a cat.
Fanny was shocked.
They say somebody made a mistake when he was still in the bottle. Thought he was a gamma and began treatment to slow down development before the mistake was discovered. That's why he's so short. What nonsense!
Lenina was very angry. Back to back, Fanny and Lenina continued their changing in silence.
There, I'm ready,
said Lenina after a while. Fanny remained silent with her head turned away.
Let's make peace, Fanny darling. Do I look all right?
Her jacket was made of bottle green cloth with green artificial fur at the wrists and collar. A smart green and white cap shaded her eyes. She had on a pair of green shorts with long white socks turned down below the knee. Her shoes were bright green and highly polished. Round her waist she wore a green belt of artificial leather filled with the official supply of contraceptives.
Perfect,
cried Fanny with a smile. She could never resist Lenina's friendliness for long.
And what a perfectly sweet Malthusian belt. I simply must get one like it.
And all this time the shelves of bottles were moving forward with the faint humming of machinery, slowly, steadily, 33 centimetres an hour, in the faint light of countless red lamps. Chapter 4. Bernard Marx. The lift was crowded with men from the Alpha changing rooms, and Lenina was greeted with many nods and smiles as she stepped into it. She was a popular girl and, at one time or another, had spent a night with almost all of them. In a corner she saw the small, thin body and the sad face of Bernard Marx.
Bernard.
She moved to his side.
I was looking for you.
Her voice could be clearly heard above the sound of the rising lift. The others looked round.
I'd simply love to come with you in July, she went on.
There. She was making known publicly that she was going to stop being faithful to Henry. Fanny ought to be pleased, even though it was with Bernard.
That is, said Lenina with her warmest smile, if you still want to have me.
Bernard's pale face turned red.
Why?
She wondered in surprise, but at the same time touched by this strange proof of her power. Hadn't we better talk about it somewhere else? He said awkwardly, looking terribly uncomfortable.
As though I had been saying something shocking, thought Lenina. He couldn't look more upset if I'd made a dirty joke, asked him who his mother was or something like that.
I mean, with all these people about. He was covered with confusion. Lenina laughed out loud with honest amusement. "How funny you are," she said, and she quite genuinely did think him funny.
"You'll give me at least a week's warning, won't you?" she went on in a different voice. "I suppose we take the Blue Pacific rocket. Does it start from the Charing T Tower, or is it from Hampstead?"
Before Bernard could answer, the lift stopped. "Roof," called the Epsilon Minus liftman in his ugly voice. He opened the gates. It was warm and sunny on the roof. The summer afternoon was filled with the hum of passing helicopters and the deeper note of the rocket planes speeding out of sight through the bright sky 8 or 10 kilometers overhead. Bernard Marks drew a deep breath. He looked up into the sky and round about him, and finally down into Lenina's face.
"Isn't it beautiful?"
His voice trembled a little. She smiled at him with an expression of the most sympathetic understanding.
"Simply perfect for obstacle golf," she answered warmly. "And now I must fly, Bernard. Henry gets cross if I keep him waiting. Let me know in good time about the date."
And waving her hand, she ran away across the wide, flat roof towards the helicopter parks. Bernard stood watching the flash of her white legs, the sunburnt knees bending and unbending, and the soft movement of those well-fitted shorts beneath the bottle-green jacket as she ran lightly over the roof. His face wore an expression of pain. Henry had had his machine wheeled out of its lockup and, when Lenina arrived, was already sitting in the pilot's seat, waiting. "4 minutes late," was all he said as she climbed in beside him. He started the engines and set the lifting blades in motion. The machine shot straight up into the air. Henry increased the speed, and the sound of the blades grew higher and thinner. They were rising at almost 2 kilometers a minute. London grew smaller and smaller beneath them. The huge table-topped buildings became smaller and smaller. In the middle of them, the tall finger of the Charing T Tower lifted towards the sky the shining circle of its landing platform. Huge white clouds lay sleepily in the blue air above their heads. Out of one of them suddenly dropped a small, bright red insect. "There's the red rocket," said Henry. "Just come in from New York." Looking at his watch, he added, 7 minutes behind time." He shook his head. "These Atlantic services, they're getting more and more irregular." He reduced the speed of the lifting blades, and the helicopter stopped rising. He set the forward engine in motion, and they moved ahead. When the machine had enough forward speed to fly on its planes, he shut off the power from the lifting blades. They flew over factory after factory. In one place, an army of black and light brown workmen was laying a new surface on the Great West Road. At Brentford, the Television Corporation's factory was like a small town.
"They must be changing the shift," said Lenina. "What a horrible colour light brown is," she added, unconsciously repeating the sleep-taught lessons of her early years. Gamma girls and the undersized epsilons crowded round the entrances, or stood in lines to take their places in the trains. Beta minuses came and went among the crowd. The roof of the main building was alive with helicopters arriving and departing. My word, said Lenina. I'm glad I'm not a gamma.
10 minutes later, they had arrived at the golf course and had started their first round of obstacle golf. With eyes lowered to avoid meeting the eyes of his fellow creatures, Bernard hurried across the roof. He felt worried and lonely. Even Lenina was making him suffer, although she meant well. He remembered those weeks during which he had looked and wished and almost given up hope of ever having the courage to ask her. Did he dare risk being shamed by a cruel refusal? But if she were to say yes, what joy! Well, now she had said it, and he was still unhappy. Unhappy that she should have thought it such a perfect afternoon for obstacle golf, that she should have hurried away to join Henry Foster, that she should have found him funny for not wanting to talk of their most private affairs in public. Unhappy, in a word, because she had behaved as any good, healthy English girl ought to behave, and not in some other unusual, extraordinary way. He opened the door of his lock-up and called to a couple of Delta Minus attendants to come and push his machine out onto the roof. The helicopter park was staffed by a single Bokanovsky group, and the men were twins, small, black, and very ugly. Bernard gave his orders in the sharp tone of one who does not feel certain of his authority. Bernard's height was 8 centimeters short of the standard alpha height. Contact with members of the lower classes always reminded him painfully of his fault, and made him speak to them more roughly than was natural to him. He climbed into the plane, and a minute later was flying south towards the river. The various departments of propaganda and the College of Emotional Engineering were housed in a single 60-floor building in Fleet Street. On the lower floors were the presses and offices of the 3 great London newspapers: the Hourly Radio, an upper-class sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and, on light brown paper and in very short words, the Delta Mirror. Then came the departments of propaganda by television and by artificial voice and music, 22 floors of them. Above were the research laboratories and the studio rooms in which the soundtrack writers and artificial music writers did their delicate work. The top 18 floors were occupied by the College of Emotional Engineering. Bernard landed on the roof of Propaganda House and stepped out. "Ring down to Mr. Helmholtz Watson," he ordered the Gamma Plus attendant, "and tell him that Mr. Bernard Marx is waiting on the roof." He sat down and lit a cigarette. Helmholtz Watson was writing when the message came down. "Tell him I'm coming at once," he said, and replaced the receiver. Then, turning to his secretary, "I'll leave you to put my things away," he went on in the same official tone, and, taking no notice of her inviting smile, got up and walked quickly to the door. He was a powerfully built man with a deep chest and broad shoulders, yet quick in his movements. In a masterful way, he was attractive and looked, as his secretary was never tired of repeating, every centimetre an Alpha Plus. By profession, he was a lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering, Department of Writing, and, in the intervals of his educational activities, a working emotional engineer. He wrote regularly for the Hourly Radio and had a great gift for writing mottos and easily remembered phrases. Able was the opinion of those above him. Perhaps, and they would shake their heads and lower their voices, a little too able. Yes, a little too able. They were right. Too much intelligence had produced in Helmholtz Watson effects very like those which, in Bernard Marx, were the result of a body not sufficiently developed. Too little bone and muscle had set Bernard apart from his fellow men. That which had made Helmholtz feel so uncomfortably alone was too much ability. But although Bernard had suffered all his life from this feeling, it was only recently that Helmholtz had become aware of it. A first-class sportsman, an untiring lover, an excellent committee man, and very popular socially, he had nevertheless realized quite suddenly that sport, women, professional and social activities were not, so far as he was concerned, the most important things in life. Really, deep down, he was interested in something else. But in what? That was the problem which Bernard had come to discuss with him. Or rather, since it was always Helmholtz who did all the talking, to listen to his friend discussing once again. 3 lovely girls from the Department of Propaganda by Artificial Voice took hold of his arm as he stepped out of the lift. "Oh, Helmholtz, darling, do come and have a day out with us on Exmoor." They hung onto his arm in their efforts to persuade him. He shook his head and pushed his way through them. "No, no." "We're not inviting any other man." But Helmholtz was not moved even by this pleasant promise. "No," he repeated, "I'm busy." And he walked firmly on. The girls followed him. It was not until he had actually climbed into Bernard's plane and shut the door that they gave up following him. They were offended by his refusal. "These women," he said as the machine rose into the air. "These women!" And he shook his head in his annoyance. "Too awful," Bernard pretended to agree, although he silently wished that he could have as many girls as Helmholtz did, and with as little trouble. He was seized with a sudden urgent need to talk about his own success. "I'm taking Lenina Crown to New Mexico with me," he said, trying to keep the pride out of his voice. "Are you?" said Helmholtz, with no show of interest at all. The rest of the short flight passed in silence. When they had arrived and were comfortably seated in Bernard's room, Helmholtz began to speak. "Did you ever feel," he asked slowly, "as though you had something inside you that was only waiting for you to give it the chance to come out? Some sort of extra power that you could be using if you knew how?" "You mean all the emotions one might be feeling if things were different?" Helmholtz shook his head. "Not quite. I'm thinking of a strange feeling I sometimes get, a feeling that I've got something important to say, and the power to say it, only I don't know what it is, and I can't make any use of the power. If there was some different way of writing, or else something different to write about. I'm pretty good at inventing phrases that seem new and exciting, even if they're about something completely obvious. But that doesn't seem enough. It's not enough for the phrases to be good. What you make with them ought to be good too." "But your things are good, Helmholtz." "Oh, as far as they go. But they go such a little way. They aren't important enough somehow. I feel I could do something much more important." "Yes, and more forceful, more violent. But what? What is there more important to say?"
Words are the most powerful of weapons if you use them properly. They'll cut through anything. But what's the good of that if the things you write about have no power in them? Can you say something about nothing? That's my problem. I try and I try. Quiet, said Bernard suddenly, lifting a warning finger. They listened. I believe there's somebody at the door, he whispered. Helmholtz got up, moved silently across the room, and with a sharp, quick movement threw the door wide open. There was, of course, nobody there. I'm sorry, said Bernard, feeling and looking uncomfortably silly. I suppose I've let things worry me a bit. I think people are talking about me all the time. He passed his hand across his eyes and breathed deeply. You don't know the trouble I've had recently, he said, almost tearfully. He was filled with a sudden wave of self-pity. You just don't know. Helmholtz Watson listened with a certain sense of discomfort. Poor little Bernard, he said to himself. But at the same time he felt rather ashamed for his friend. He wished Bernard would show a little more pride.